Welcome to the Ambient iPad. In this video, it's the Mellotron meets Fingerlab apps, specifically Mellowsound and iPhilacorda. Mellowsound is Fingerlab's take on the Mellotron, and it includes samples from their own M400, so it's got a lot of cool idiosyncrasies. And iPhilacorda is based on a Dutch organ from the 1960s, Philacorda, put out by Philips. For the Mellotron, I'll be using Chamberlin sounds, specifically a flute, a bass clarinet, a muted trumpet, vibraphone, marimba, and maybe some piano at the end. The signal chain is the Mellotron M4000D Mini. Its master mono analog output goes into a Boss volume pedal. The mono output from the volume pedal goes into a Boss RE-202 Space Echo. And the stereo output from the Space Echo goes into a Universal Audio Volt 276 interface that communicates back and forth with the iPad Pro. I have a setup here in AUM. For the Mellotron, I'm going to be using just Chamberlin Music Master sounds. Just getting a little, got all these Chamberlin sounds in here, figure I should start using them. On the Fingerlab side, we're using Mellowsound, which is their Mellotron app. Really like this. Out of all the Mellotron apps out there, I really like Mellowsound the best for a number of reasons. It has some key classic sounds. It's very inexpensive. But most importantly, they just sampled the M400 that they had. So you get a lot of the idiosyncrasies of the tapes that they happen to get with that Mellotron. I'm also using iPhilacorda, which is, Philacorda was a Philips organ, a Dutch Philips organ from the 60s. So I'm using two instances of that. Let me close up Mellowsound. And the Fingerlab apps are triggered by Bram Bos Rozeta Collider. And I'll go through all of this because what I'm doing here is I've got the Mellowsound Mellotron doing flute. Let's get up here to the flute. And let me make sure that the effects are set the way I want. And then we've got a couple of different organ sounds. The first one here in the middle, which will actually be the second organ sound that's triggered by Collider, is more of pads. And the last instance here of iPhilacorda, I'm using more of a farfisa sound, and that's a little more shorter gate, so just a little more staccato, and you can control that in Collider. So why don't I just start with demonstrating the Chamberlin Music Master sounds from the M4000D. I'm going to be using the Space Echo just as a tape delay, no looping. So let's start here with the flute sound. Actually, that's piano. Let's move over here to the flute. Let me turn the effects off. And on. Still got the piano going with that in the background. Let's get the decay down there. A little too much decay. Down the reverb. So it's an M400 flute. But actually it's a Mark II flute. A lot of the tapes for the Chamberlin were the Mellotron tapes. They just, actually the Chamberlin tapes in some cases were the original tapes, and then Mellotron through the different lawsuits. I've gone through the history of Mellotron before. Just go online and you can read how one of the Chamberlin salesmen essentially went over to England and said, hey, I've got this instrument. Well, it wasn't his instrument, but they started making it in England and they called it the Mellotron, and there was a court case. And essentially, Mellotron had to just license a lot of stuff from Chamberlin, including the tapes. And in many cases, I find the Chamberlin tapes are cleaner and a little more realistic if you're looking for a more realistic versus that kind of Mellotron crunchiness sound. But either way, they're really good. Besides the flute, I'll be using bass clarinet. Let's just leave the effects on. And the other sound I'll use is something I've never used before, muted trumpet. Always glad to be able to fit in some of these sounds that I really have a tough time finding a venue for or a piece for, but it'll actually fit into this. I should say that It's cold out, it's rainy out. This is just going to be kind of a mellow or dark piece. It's not, while Collider is going, it's, you know, it's not creating these kind of driving sequences. There's no percussion going here. It's just, my other goal for this piece was to make a short piece. I'm trying to make a piece that's a little shorter than usual too, so we'll see where we go. Back to the Chamberlin. The other sounds I'll be doing are more towards the end. We'll use the marimba. Might use the vibraphone on here. Let me see if I can find that. Kind of stuck somewhere in the middle. There we go. Whoops, nope. Vibraphone. All right, let's get that back to the flute because that's what we're going to start with. And finally, towards the end, maybe I'll throw in some Chamberlin piano. Sounds a lot like, sounds again, Chamberlin, very much more realistic sounds. One of the reasons is that on the original tapes that they use versus when Mellotron made their own tapes is the Chamberlin often used just better microphones, different studio. Again, it just has more of a realistic sound to it. Okay, enough about that. Let's move on to what we're going to be using Fingerlab for. So let's get back to the flute for later. And let me start with Mellowsound. We're starting with a flute sound. It's Collider Instance 1, which is this grid layout. I've demonstrated Collider before. There's a lot of videos out there on it. We're using a E minor harmonic scale for everything. Let me just press play here. Okay, we've got more than the flute going. Yeah, that's because the second one's here. Let me get this up. Let's get the volume up. All right. Back to where we were. So I've lifted the pitch a little bit just so it'll cut through. What I found with a lot of these sounds from Fingerlab is they're a little darker, which is fine. Those are the instruments they came from. And you can control the tone as well. But I find that it still gets a little lost when they all get going. So just raising the pitch a little just helps it cut through. Also for the gate length, so you can control this, and it obviously makes the sound a little more staccato. And you can keep going. I've got this set to the highest, which is a 2-beat gate, so very legato sounding. Which with Collider is helpful because it is more of those staccato sounds kind of right out of the box. All right, so that's Mellowsound. Let's go to the first instance of iPhilacorda here. This is the pads. Kind of hear that. So this, I'm not going to go through a whole demo of this. Love Fingerlab apps. I'm just using these two. These are the two that mimic kind of, or based on real vintage instruments. They have other synths and other apps as well. So again, very mellow, very kind of quiet, dark-ish. So that's our pad sound. And I'm not using any AUV3 effects for the Mellotron or for the Fingerlab apps. The Fingerlab apps have very good effects processors on them. So for instance, in here, you know, we've got a tube amp, a tremolo, I've got the phaser on, and I've got the tape delay on. All right, let's turn that off and turn that down. And let's raise the farfisa. Up here and then go over to this instance of Collider. So on this one, I have the gate length at 1/8 notes because I want that staccato sound. Again, I raise the pitch a little just to cut through, and after this, I'll turn all 3 of the Fingerlab examples on here, and you can kind of hear how things kind of pop out, pop in, and they can get a little lost. But if I raise the gate length, you can hear how that changes. And I take it back. I have the gate length on the others 2 beats. You can go up to 2 bars. it just gets really muddy and smeary, but I want the eighth notes here. All right, let's bring everything else back in. You know, again, I'm using the internal effects. It's got reverb right on the front. You go right into the effects, just tape delay on this. Let me just get that going. Clearly, I'll need to play with the levels. Now, what's interesting is all of the Collider instances, this is all E harmonic minor, but when I bring the pads in, it definitely introduces a little dissonance based on the notes that it's playing. While they're still all in that E harmonic minor scale, you know, you're getting seconds and the sixth doubled, and I mean, that's the mood I'm going for, just a little kind of off center here and a little darker. Right now it's kind of, but so I'm going to lower the volume of, actually let me lower the volume of both of these. So we're back to the flutes. And again, you know, towards the end I may change this to a different sound like the vibraphone. Let me just bring this in so we can figure out a good level here. This is the Farfisa sound. Very staccato. It's about there. So let me go up just a little more. We'll go to -6 dB. I've got Mellowsound at +2 because it's quieter. I mean, again, I could just go in here and jack the volume on the app itself. Same with here, but... And now let's bring the pad in. I just want this kind of in the background because, as you heard before, when it's more at the same level in the foreground, you just get to focus on that dissonance, which is good. It just needs to blend a little more in the background. Let's bring that up and figure out. So it's quiet sound to begin with. Why don't we have this at 6 as well? So it's just really, really in the background there. As far as the piece goes, I think what I'll do is I'll just start, so I'm just going to demonstrate maybe some of the structure I'm thinking of, so we'll be a little more abrupt here. Let me turn off the iPhilacordas. We've just got the flutes going, so maybe in the beginning I do some stuff with the flute. Let me just turn the volume all the way up on the pedal. A little more breathy than the Chamberlin, a little more breathy than the Mark II flute. And then we'll bring in the Farfisa. Then maybe the bass clarinet sound over that. And as I'm playing this, as I'm going through, I can control the volume of the M4000D Mini with the volume pedal. Just have it blended a little more. And again, we're just using the space echo as a tape delay. All right, let's bring in the chords too, that pad. And over this is when I'm going to use the muted trumpet. There's also a muted trombone, but let's use the muted trumpet. And one other thing I want to point out is you can see, because I'm not using any other AUV3s, no spatializer. So the sound is, you know, it's way more in the center. I'm not going to call it mono because the space echo is stereo. It's just very subtle. Now for Mellowsound and one of the instances of iPhilacorda, I just have the balance, because if all these are centered, there's definitely a little more of a mono quality to it. That's probably not the best way to say it. It's more because I use spatializer so much, I'm used to this very wide stereo field. But when you have multiple instruments going, particularly in the background, that's unnecessary. You just place them in different parts of the stereo field. So the Mellowsound flutes are just slightly off to the right, excuse me, the left. And the Farfisa iPhilacorda sound is a little to the right, and then the pads are right in the middle. And then what I might do towards the end is, let's get that marimba. Maybe we'll fade out the Farfisa, maybe the flute, I don't know. Actually, what I will do is change the flute to the vibraphone. And to make this smooth, I'm listening to the flute on Mellowsound, and there are some points where there's a little gap. And let's see if this works. Just have to wait for it to come around. Nope, keeps coming. All right, I'm just switching it. Actually, that was pretty good. But hear how it changes. This is cool. To me, this is like a very Pink Floyd-ish. If you're familiar with very old Floyd, and one of my favorite Floyd albums is the soundtrack to the film More from 1968 or maybe early 69, I think it came out. Anyway, there's a very, very ambient piece on there with vibraphone called Quicksilver. And this kind of has a similar vibe, but not saying that I'm Pink Floyd space music, but... And then a little marimba here. And then we'll end with the piano. Something like that. And then we can fade out the vibraphone and just have the pad fade out at the end as well. And that's it. Again, very quiet, very kind of mellow. Let me reset everything up and I'll do a jam. This was more of a mellow ambient jam. Instead of sequences triggering synths, I just had them trigger some of the sounds in the Fingerlab apps. Now for the flute, with Collider, I really used the gate in all those different sounds. So for the flute, I was kind of in the middle where I was getting some legato on that flute sound from the Mellowsound Mellotron, but it wasn't so much that it was kind of smearing and overlapping each other. I did have a longer gate on one of the iPhilacorda sounds where I wanted more of a pad, and it's really good for that. But then I dialed it back so it was more of a staccato percussive sound for the iPhilacorda Farfisa example that I used as well. So just changing the gate between the three sounds hopefully made them sit a little better and made them all not just get lost in one another. Now I raised the pitch in Collider to kind of have them cut through as well. Had a little bit of a more brighter tone because these instruments are more vintage sounding, a little more darker sounding, but I'm kind of happy the way it turned out. And then I rarely use the Chamberlin on the Mellotron, but it just seemed to be a good idea. A little more realistic sounds there to go with those 60-ish, 70s, the M400 Mellowsound emulation, and then the organ from the 60s emulation. So I used a lot of sounds that I would typically use with a Mark II Mellotron or the M400, other than the muted trumpet. Just like in a couple of videos ago, I was looking for a place to use a bassoon. I'm looking for a place to use a muted trumpet. There are some sounds that it's just really difficult to find a place to fit in. But on this more ambient mellow piece, it didn't do too bad. Now, I use very minimal effects, mainly the effects that were part of the Mellowsound apps, and then, of course, the Space Echo for the Mellotron itself. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. And good luck with your own music.